The year was 2847, and the galaxy had changed forever since humanity first stepped beyond their small blue planet. They had found that the universe was full of life, full of ancient empires and strange civilizations that had been watching the stars for millions of years, before humans ever learned to make fire among all these alien species. None were more powerful or more feared than the Dracorians. They were massive creatures that looked like the dragons from old Earth legends, with scales that shimmered in colors that told others about their rank and their bloodline. Their voices could shake buildings, and their roars could be heard across entire cities. They ruled over 17 star systems, and their empire stretched across a quarter of the known galaxy. The Dracorian way of life was built on strength and power. They believed that a true leader must have a voice that commands respect, a roar that makes enemies tremble, and words that echo through history. To be silent was to be weak, and to be weak was to be nothing at all on a space station called Horizon's Edge. Far from the center of any empire, there was a small diner that served travelers and traders from across the galaxy. The place was called Megan's Place, and it had been passed down through 3 generations of the Torres family. The current owner was a young woman named Megan Torres, who had inherited the diner from her grandmother just 2 years before. Megan was 26 years old, with warm brown eyes and dark hair that she always kept pulled back in a simple ponytail. She had a kind face and a gentle smile that made everyone who walked through her door feel welcome. She ran the diner with help from her younger brother Danny, who was 22 and always cracking jokes, and her best friend Katie, who had been like a sister to her since they were children. The diner was nothing special to look at. It had simple tables and comfortable booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and big windows that looked out at the stars and the ships that came and went from the station. But what made it special was the feeling inside. A warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. A sense that anyone who entered was welcome regardless of what planet they came from or what species they were on this particular day. The station's lights flickered and dimmed in a way that everyone recognized. It meant that someone important had arrived, someone whose ship was so massive that it drew extra power just by docking. Whispers spread through the diner, like wildfire as people checked their communication devices and shared the news with each other. High King Valther of the Dracorian Empire had come to Horizon's Edge. This was unheard of. The Dragon King never traveled to small stations like this one. He held court on his throne world surrounded by armies and advisors. But word was that he had come for secret negotiations with the human coalition. Talk so sensitive that they needed to happen far from prying eyes and listening ears. Megan watched through the window as the royal shuttle detached from the main ship and glided toward the station. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, all black metal and sharp angles, with the golden crest of the Dracorian royal family blazing on its side within minutes. The diner's door slid open and the temperature seemed to drop. High King Valther entered first, and Megan had to fight the urge to step backward. He was enormous, nearly 9 feet tall, with scales as black as the void between stars. His eyes were like molten gold, and they swept across the room with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged in his entire life. Behind him came a dozen advisors and guards, all of them massive and intimidating, but it was the last figure that caught Megan's attention. Walking several steps behind the king was a smaller Dracorian, barely adult by their standards, perhaps equivalent to a human in his early 20s. His scales were not black like his father's, but a soft silver blue that seemed almost gentle. His eyes were large and deep, holding a sadness that Megan recognized instantly because she had seen it before in people who had been alone for far too long. This was Prince Kellen, the king's only son, and Megan realized with a start that she had heard stories about him. Whispered rumors that said the prince was defective, that he had been born without the vocal chambers that gave Dracorians their powerful voices. He could not speak, could not roar, could not make any sound at all. In a culture that valued the voice above all else, he was considered a disgrace. The king and his main advisors took over the largest private booth in the back of the diner. Important-looking documents were spread across the table, and serious conversations began in low, rumbling voices. The guards positioned themselves around the room, watching everything with sharp eyes, and Prince Callan was directed to a small table near the window. Far from the important discussions, far from his father, far from everyone, Megan watched as the young prince sat down alone. No one accompanied him. No one spoke to him. The servants and guards looked through him as if he were not even there. Even the other patrons in the diner, humans and aliens alike, avoided looking in his direction, as if his condition might somehow be contagious. Danny came up beside Megan and spoke quietly, asking if someone should take the prince's order. Katie shook her head quickly, her eyes wide with fear. She said she did not know Dracorian customs and was terrified of accidentally offending the prince, or worse, offending his father, the king. What if she did something wrong and caused an intergalactic incident? The other servers suddenly found urgent tasks that needed their attention in the kitchen or the storage room, or anywhere that was not near the lonely prince by the window. Megan looked at the young Dracorian sitting in complete isolation. He had been placed at that table like an unwanted piece of luggage, something to be kept out of sight until it was time to leave. His clawed hands rested on the table in front of him, and his silver blue eyes gazed out at the stars with an expression that broke her heart. She remembered something her grandmother had told her many years ago, back when Megan was just a little girl learning to run the diner. Her grandmother had said that every soul who walks through our door deserves to be seen, deserves to be welcomed, deserves to know that they matter. It did not matter if they were rich or poor, powerful or weak, loud or silent. Every single one of them was worthy of kindness. Megan grabbed a menu from the counter and began walking toward the isolated table. Katie grabbed her arm and asked her what she was doing. Danny looked worried, but also a little proud. Megan just smiled and said that she was doing her job. She was going to take an order from a customer. As she walked across the diner, she could feel eyes on her from every direction. The Dracorian guards watched her with suspicion. The other patrons stared with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Even the king glanced up from his negotiations for a moment, before dismissing her as unimportant. But Megan kept walking until she stood beside the prince's table, and that was when she noticed something that changed everything. The prince was moving his clawed fingers in small, careful patterns against the surface of the table. At first, she thought he was simply drumming his fingers out of boredom. But then she looked more closely, and her breath caught in her throat. She recognized those movements. They were not random gestures or nervous habits. They were words. They were signs. The prince was using sign language. The same sign language that Megan had learned as a child when her deaf cousin Lucas had come to live with her family. The prince was talking to himself in a language that no one around him could understand, practicing phrases and sentences that no one ever responded to, having conversations that existed only in the silence of his own isolation. Megan set down the menu and made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. She raised her hands and began to sign. Megan's hands moved slowly and carefully, forming the sign she had learned so many years ago when she was just a child. She signed a simple greeting, telling the prince that her name was Megan and asking him how he was doing today and whether he would like something to eat or drink. Prince Callan's reaction was something she would never forget. For as long as she lived, his entire body went rigid, and his silver blue scales seemed to brighten with a sudden inner light. His large eyes grew even wider, and his clawed hands froze in mid-motion above the table. For a long, terrible moment, Megan thought she had made a horrible mistake, that she had somehow insulted him or violated some sacred Dracorian custom that she did not know about then. The prince's hands began to move, trembling so badly that she almost could not read the signs. He asked her a question, just 3 simple words that carried the weight of a lifetime of loneliness. "You understand me?" Megan smiled and nodded, signing back that yes, she could understand him perfectly, and that she was very happy to meet him. She asked again if he would like anything from the menu. The prince stared at her as if she had reached into the sky and pulled down a star just for him. His hands moved again, faster now, but still shaking with emotion. He told her that no one had ever done this before, that no one had ever tried to speak with him like this. Not as a servant delivering instructions or a doctor examining a patient, but as a real person having a real conversation. Megan felt her heart break a little at those words. She had known loneliness in her life, had felt the sting of being overlooked and forgotten. But she could not imagine what it must be like to spend your entire existence surrounded by people who refused to acknowledge that you existed. She asked if she could sit down, knowing that it probably broke every rule about how servants were supposed to behave around royalty. The prince nodded eagerly, and she pulled out the chair across from him and sat, placing the menu on the table between them. For the next few minutes, they exchanged basic information through their hands. Megan told him about herself, about her grandmother who had started the diner and her parents, who had run it after her, and how she had taken over when she turned 24. She told him about her brother Danny, who was always making people laugh, and her best friend Katie, who was like a sister to her. The prince listened with intense focus, his eyes never leaving her hands. When it was his turn, he told her his name was Kellen, and that he was the son of High King Velther, though she probably already knew that. He said he was 23 years old, which was still young by Dracorian standards, and that he had lived his entire life in the royal palace on the Dracorian throne world. Megan asked him what his life was like there. Brightness in his scales dimmed slightly as he answered. He told her that he lived in a tower at the edge of the palace grounds, a beautiful prison with high windows that looked out over the capital city. He had servants who brought him food and clothes and books, and a nurse who had cared for him since he was a hatchling, but he had no friends and no visitors. His father rarely came to see him, and when he did, the conversations were brief and uncomfortable. He explained that in Dracorian culture, a person's worth was measured by the power of their voice. A warrior who could roar loud enough to shake the enemy's courage was considered a hero. A leader who could speak words that echoed through history was considered great. But someone who could make no sound at all, someone who was born without the ability to speak or roar or even whisper, was considered less than nothing. He had been hidden away since childhood, kept out of sight so that he would not embarrass his father or cast doubt on the strength of the royal bloodline. He had never been to a proper school, never attended a royal function, never been allowed to meet other young Dracorians his own age. He had spent his years reading ancient texts in his tower and watching ships come and go from the palace spaceport. Dreaming of worlds and adventures he would never experience. Megan listened to all of this with growing sadness and also growing anger. How could anyone treat their own child this way? How could a father lock away his son simply because he was different? How could an entire civilization decide that someone had no value just because they could not make noise with their throat? She asked him how he had learned sign language if no one would communicate with him. The prince smiled slightly, the first smile she had seen on his face. He explained that his nurse, an elderly female named Sila, who had cared for him since he was born, had taught him. Sila had traveled widely in her youth and had encountered humans who used this language to communicate. She had learned it out of curiosity and then taught it to young Kellen when it became clear that he would never be able to speak. But Sila was the only one. He signed with sadness returning to his features. No one else had ever bothered to learn, Not his father, not his tutors, not any of the hundreds of servants and guards who moved through the palace. They communicated with him through written notes when absolutely necessary and ignored him the rest of the time. Until now, he added, his silver eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Until Megan was not sure what to say to that, so instead she asked him what kind of food he liked. The question seemed to surprise him and then amuse him. He admitted that he had never been asked such a simple, ordinary question before, and that he was not sure how to answer. She suggested they start with something sweet and stood up to get him a plate of honey cakes and a pot of warm tea. As she walked to the counter, she could feel his eyes following her. Still amazed that this conversation was actually happening, Danny and Katie both rushed over to her, asking what was going on and whether everything was all right. Megan just smiled and told them she was taking care of a customer who needed a little extra attention. She loaded up a tray with the tea and cakes and carried it back to the prince's table. When she set down the honey cakes, his eyes widened with recognition. He signed that these looked very similar to a Dracorian delicacy called sweet drops, which had been his favorite treat as a child. Megan laughed and told him that honey cakes were her favorite too, and that maybe their two species were not so different after all. For the next hour they talked about everything and nothing. She told him about Earth and its blue oceans and green forests. He told her about his home world with its crystal mountains and rivers of molten gold. She described human music and art and the way her grandmother used to sing while cooking. He described Dracorian architecture and the ancient poems that were carved into the walls of the oldest temples. At some point the conversation turned more serious. The prince asked her why humans had developed sign language in the first place. Megan explained that throughout human history, there had always been people who could not hear or could not speak. And instead of casting them aside, humans had created ways to include them. The prince seemed amazed by this. He asked if humans truly considered such people to be equal to everyone else. Megan told him that it had not always been that way, and that humans had struggled with these ideas for a long time. But eventually, they had come to understand that a person's worth was not determined by their abilities or disabilities, but by the content of their character and the kindness in their heart. She told him about Beethoven, a famous composer who had created some of the most beautiful music in human history, even after he lost the ability to hear it. She told him about Helen Keller, who could neither see nor hear, but had become a powerful voice for change and justice. She told him about all the countless humans who had faced similar challenges and had proven that silence did not mean weakness. The prince listened to every word, his eyes shining with something that might have been hope. Your silence is not a flaw, Megan signed to him with firm conviction. It is simply a different way of being. And those who cannot see your worth are the ones who are truly blind. Across the diner, hidden in the shadows near the private booth, Commander Zero watched the exchange with calculating eyes. She was not merely an advisor as most believed. She was the king's spy master, trained to observe and evaluate everything. And what she was witnessing now was something that could change everything. Commander Zero had served the Dracorian throne for over 40 years. She had watched empires rise and fall, had orchestrated the downfall of enemies and the elevation of allies, and had learned to read situations with a precision that bordered on supernatural. She knew when something important was happening, even before those involved understood it themselves. And right now, watching the human waitress converse with the forgotten prince, she knew she was witnessing something that had never happened before in the history of the Dracorian Empire. The prince was transformed. His scales, which normally held a dull gray tinge of prolonged sadness, now shimmered with a silver-blue brightness that Zyril had only seen in healthy, happy Dracorians. His posture, usually hunched and withdrawn, had straightened with a confidence she would not have believed possible. And his eyes, Those large, sad eyes that had stared at nothing for so many years were alive with light and emotion. She had been assigned to watch the prince since his birth, to assess whether he posed any threat to the succession or stability of the empire. Her reports had always been the same. The prince was harmless, powerless, and completely irrelevant. He had no allies, no ambitions, and no way to communicate with anyone who might help him claim power. He was a non-entity, best ignored and forgotten. But now she watched him laugh at something the human female sighed, his shoulders shaking with silent mirth, and she realized that all her previous assessments had been dangerously incomplete. The prince was not powerless because he lacked ability. He was powerless because no one had ever given him the tools to express himself. And now, somehow, this simple human had handed him exactly those tools. Cheryl made a decision. She would need to inform the king across the diner. Megan and Kellen continued their conversation, unaware of the watching eyes. The prince had just finished telling her about his favorite book, an ancient Dracorian text about a warrior who traveled to the edge of the galaxy and discovered that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined. Megan asked him if he had ever wanted to travel like that warrior, to see the stars and visit other worlds. The prince's hands moved slowly as he answered. He admitted that he had dreamed of nothing else for his entire life. Every ship that passed his tower window was a reminder of all the places he would never go and all the adventures he would never have. He had memorized the names of 1,000 stars and could describe the surface of dozens of planets, even though he had never left his home world. Then why haven't you gone? Megan asked. The prince looked at her with confusion. He explained that he was not allowed, that his father had forbidden him from leaving the palace grounds, that everyone believed he was too weak and too fragile to survive in the wider galaxy. Megan frowned and sighed back that she did not understand. He seemed perfectly capable to her. Yes, he could not speak with his voice, but that did not mean he could not think or learn or adapt. Humans with his condition had traveled to every corner of their own history, had climbed mountains and crossed oceans and even walked on other worlds. The prince seemed stunned by this perspective. He admitted that no one had ever suggested that he might be capable of anything. His entire life he had been told that his silence made him useless, that he could never lead or fight or contribute anything of value. He had believed it because everyone around him believed it. That is their failure, not yours. Megan sighed with a fierce expression on her face. They looked at you and saw only what you could not do. They never bothered to discover what you could do. She told him about her cousin Lucas, who had been born deaf and had faced similar prejudice and doubt throughout his childhood. People had told Lucas that he would never succeed, that he would always need others to take care of him, that he should accept his limitations and not reach for impossible dreams. But Lucas had refused to accept those limits. He had worked harder than anyone Megan had ever known, had learned to read lips and communicate in multiple ways, had excelled in school despite the challenges. Now he was a successful engineer who designed spacecraft for the human coalition. A man who had proven every doubter wrong through nothing but determination and courage. He did not let others define him. Megan sighed. And you should not either. The prince was quiet for a long moment, his clawed fingers still against the table. Finally he sighed that he did not know if he could be that brave. He had spent so many years believing what everyone told him about himself that he was not sure how to believe anything different. Megan reached across the table and gently touched his clawed hand. It was a human gesture of comfort that probably meant nothing in Dracorian culture, but somehow he seemed to understand. His silver eyes met hers, and she saw tears forming in them, the first tears he had allowed himself in years. You are not broken, she signed with her free hand. You are not less than anyone. You are a person with thoughts and feelings and dreams, and every single one of those things matters. The only ones who are broken are those who refuse to see that. At that moment, a shadow fell across the table. Megan looked up and felt her heart nearly stop. King Velther stood before them, his massive form blocking out the light from the overhead fixtures. His golden eyes were fixed on the scene before him with an expression that Megan could not read. Behind him stood Commander Zero, her face carefully neutral. "What is the meaning of this?" the king demanded, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. Megan stood quickly, her hands trembling but her voice steady as she spoke. She explained that she had been serving the prince, that she had noticed he was using sign language, and that she happened to know the same language. She said they had simply been having a conversation. A conversation, the king repeated, his voice heavy with something that might have been disbelief. "My son does not have conversations. My son cannot communicate." Megan felt a flash of anger that temporarily overpowered her fear. She signed as she spoke, ensuring the prince could follow her words. "With respect to your majesty, your son communicates beautifully. He is intelligent and thoughtful, and has remarkable ideas about the universe. The problem is not that he cannot speak. The problem is that no one has been willing to listen." The diner had gone completely silent. Danny and Katie stood frozen behind the counter. The Dracorian guards had tensed, ready to move if their king gave the order. Every eye in the room was fixed on the human waitress who had just spoken to the dragon. King, as if she were his equal, King Velther stared at her with those burning golden eyes. And for a terrible moment, Megan was certain she had just ended her own life. Then the king turned to look at his son. Really look at him, perhaps for the first time in years. The prince met his father's gaze without flinching, without cowering, without looking away. There was a strength in his silver eyes that had not been there before, a dignity that the king had never noticed. "Is this true?" the king asked his son directly. "Can you truly communicate through these hand gestures?" The prince raised his hands and began to sign. His movements were confident and clear, and though the king could not understand the words, he could see the meaning in his son's eyes. This was not the broken creature he had locked away in a tower. This was a young man with a voice that had simply been waiting to be heard. Commander Zero stepped forward and spoke quietly to the king. She said that the human gesture language was well documented and widely used across many species in the galaxy. She said that with proper study, anyone could learn to understand it. She said that if this was true, if the prince could truly express himself through this language, then everything they had believed about him might need to be reconsidered. The king was silent for a long moment. Then he turned back to Megan and asked her a question that would change the course of history. "Can you teach me to understand my son?" Megan stared at the Dragon King in complete shock. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this was not even close to any of them. She had prepared herself for anger, for dismissal, perhaps even for punishment. But a genuine question, a sincere request for help understanding his own son, that was something she had never imagined. The prince seemed equally stunned. His silver eyes were wide, and his hands hung motionless at his sides. He looked at his father as if seeing him for the first time. As if the massive, fearsome king had suddenly transformed into someone completely new. "Your Majesty," Megan said carefully, finding her voice after a moment of silence. "Yes, I can teach you. It takes time and practice, but anyone can learn sign language if they are willing to put in the effort." The king nodded slowly, his golden eyes shifting between Megan and his son. There was something in his expression that looked almost like shame, though it was hard to tell on a face so alien and fierce. He admitted that he had never considered that there might be another way to reach his son. In Dracorian culture, the voice was everything, and he had simply assumed that without a voice, his son was beyond reach. Commander Zero spoke up again, suggesting that perhaps the king might want to continue this conversation in private. The negotiations with the human coalition had concluded for the day, and there was no reason they could not delay their departure. She pointed out that this seemed like a matter of significant importance. The king agreed. He looked at Megan and asked if she would be willing to join them to help facilitate communication between father and son. Megan glanced at Danny and Katie, who both nodded encouragingly despite the fear in their eyes. She turned back to the king and said she would be honored to help. What followed was one of the strangest and most emotional experiences of Megan's life. She sat in the private booth with the most powerful being in 17-star systems on one side and his forgotten son on the other. Commander Zyril stood nearby, observing everything with her sharp, calculating eyes. The king asked Megan to teach him some basic signs, just enough to say a few words to his son. She started with the simplest things: greetings, the sign for father and son, the gesture for love. The king's massive clawed hands were clumsy at first, designed for war rather than delicate movements. But he practiced with a determination that surprised everyone. While he learned, Megan served as an interpreter, speaking aloud what the prince signed and signing for the prince what his father said. It was awkward and slow, but for the first time in 23 years, father and son were actually communicating. The prince asked his father why he had been kept hidden away for so long. The king was silent for a long moment before answering. He admitted that he had been afraid. In Dracorian culture, any sign of weakness in the royal bloodline could lead to challenges from rival houses, assassination attempts, even civil war. He had believed that by hiding his son, he was protecting him from those dangers. But I see now that I was also hiding him from life itself, the king said, his voice heavy with regret. I told myself I was keeping him safe, when really I was keeping him prisoner. I was so focused on what he could not do that I never allowed him to show me what he could. The prince listened to these words through Megan's interpretation, tears streaming down his scaled face. He signed back that he had always believed his father was ashamed of him, that his silence was a constant reminder of a failure in the royal blood. He had spent years hating himself for something he could not control. The king reached out with one massive clawed hand and gently touched his son's shoulder. He said that the shame was his own, not his son's. He had failed as a father in the most fundamental way possible. He had let his fear and his pride blind him to the truth that was right in front of him. You have a voice, the king said, looking at his son's hands. It is simply different from the one I expected. And that difference is my failure to understand, not yours. Megan watched this exchange with tears in her own eyes. She thought about her grandmother, who had always believed that food and kindness could heal any wound. She had never imagined that those simple principles would lead her to this moment. Sitting between a dragon king and his prince, helping to repair a relationship that had been broken for decades, Commander Zyril cleared her throat and spoke. She pointed out that this discovery had significant implications beyond just the royal family. If the prince could truly communicate through this human language, then he might be able to take on roles and responsibilities that had previously been thought impossible. He could serve the empire in ways that no one had ever considered. The king looked at his son with new eyes. He asked Kellen what he wanted, what he had dreamed of during all those years alone in his tower. The prince answered without hesitation. He signed that he wanted to see the stars, to visit the worlds he had read about in his books, to meet people from other species and learn about their cultures. He wanted to contribute something meaningful to the galaxy, to prove that his life had purpose and value. And most of all, he added, his silver eyes meeting his father's golden ones, I want to make you proud. The king was silent for a long moment. Then he made a decision that would echo through history. He declared that his son would no longer be hidden away. Instead, Callan would be educated in diplomacy and statcraft. He would be given tutors to help him develop his abilities and advisors to guide him in the ways of the galaxy. And when he was ready, he would take his rightful place as a prince of the Dracorian Empire. But first, the king said they needed to change things at home. Sign language would be taught throughout the royal court. Every advisor, every guard, every servant would learn to communicate with the prince. His silence would no longer be treated as a barrier, but as simply another way of speaking. He turned to Megan and thanked her. He said that she had given him something more valuable than any treaty or trade agreement. She had given him back his son. Megan smiled and said that she had not done anything special. She had simply treated the prince the way her grandmother had taught her to treat everyone who walked through the door of her diner. She had seen him as a person who deserved to be welcomed. The king studied her with those intense golden eyes. He said that among his people, such a simple act of kindness was rarer than the most precious gems. Dracorians were taught to value strength and power above all else. Compassion was seen as weakness, and stopping to help those who struggled was considered a waste of time and resources. Perhaps that is something else we need to learn from your people, he said. Perhaps there is more to strength than roaring and more to power than conquest. Commander Zyril made a note on her datapad. She had a feeling that this day would be remembered for a very long time, and she wanted to make sure every detail was recorded accurately outside the window. The stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the small revolution that was taking place in a tiny diner on an insignificant space station. But revolutions, Megan knew, often started in the most unexpected places. Sometimes they started with nothing more than a cup of tea and a simple question. Would you like something to eat? 3 years had passed since that fateful day at Megan's place, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Dracorian Empire, once known throughout the stars for its fierce warriors and thundering declarations, had undergone a transformation that historians would study for centuries to come. Prince Callan had emerged from his isolation like a flower finally given sunlight. With proper education and support, he had proven himself to be brilliant beyond anyone's expectations. He had a natural talent for languages, learning not just the human sign language, but also the gestural communication systems of a dozen other species. He studied diplomacy and history and economics with a hunger that came from years of having nothing to do. But read alone in a tower. King Velthor kept his word. Sign language classes became mandatory throughout the royal court, and within a year, the entire palace staff could communicate with the prince. The change rippled outward from there, spreading first to the noble houses and then to the common people. What had once been seen as a shameful weakness became fashionable and then expected. Dracorians began to take pride in their ability to speak, with their hands as well as their voices. But the biggest change came when the king announced that his son would serve as the Dracorian ambassador to the human coalition. It was a role that required patience and understanding, and the ability to listen more than speak, qualities that Callan possessed in abundance. Many at court had opposed the appointment, arguing that a prince who could not roar would be seen as weak by their enemies. The king had silenced those objections with a single response. "My son speaks more clearly than any of you," he had declared. The problem was never with his voice. It was with our ears. Ambassador Callan proved himself within months. He negotiated trade agreements that benefited both species, resolved disputes that had festered for decades, and built relationships between humans and Dracorians that went far beyond politics and economics. He visited human schools and taught children sign language, and human instructors came to Dracorian worlds to do the same. A new generation was growing up with the ability to communicate across the barrier that had once seemed impossible to cross, the gesture language that humans had created for their deaf and mute. Citizens became the universal tongue of diplomacy throughout the sector. Species that had never been able to speak to each other discovered that their hands could form the same shapes and convey the same meanings. Wars that had seemed inevitable were avoided because representatives could finally understand each other. And through all of this, Megan Torres remained in her little diner on Horizon's edge, serving travelers and traders just as her grandmother had done before her. She had received offers of wealth and position from a dozen governments, invitations to live in palaces and advise kings, but she had turned them all down. Her place was behind the counter, welcoming anyone who walked through her door, with a warm smile and a cup of tea, but she was not forgotten. Human Coalition awarded her their highest civilian honor for her contribution to interspecies relations. The Dracorian Empire declared her a friend of the throne, a title that had never before been given to someone outside their species. Scholars wrote papers about the Megan Torres moment and what it revealed about the power of simple human kindness and on the Dracorian throne world. In the center of the capital city, a statue was erected in her likeness. It showed a young human woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, her fingers frozen in the sign for welcome. Children from both species would gather around it to hear the story of the Waitress who had changed the galaxy by refusing to ignore a lonely prince. Today was the 3rd anniversary of that first meeting, and Megan stood in the capital square surrounded by thousands of Dracorians and humans and members of a dozen other species. Ambassador Callan had requested her presence for a special ceremony, and she had agreed despite her discomfort with being the center of attention. The prince stepped onto the raised platform at the center of the square. He did not have a voice to address the crowd, but he did not need one. Massive screens displayed his hand movements while translators broadcast his words in 100 languages. He began by thanking everyone for coming. He spoke about the day 3 years ago when a human waitress had walked up to his table and done something that no one else had ever done. She had treated him like a person. I had spent my entire life believing that I was broken. He sighed, his movements clear and confident. I believed that my silence made me worthless, but I had nothing to offer the galaxy, that I was a mistake that should have been corrected. I believed these things because everyone around me believed them. They could not hear my voice, so they assumed I had nothing to say. He paused and looked directly at Megan, who stood near the front of the crowd with tears already forming in her eyes. But Megan Torres saw what no one else could see. She looked at me and did not see a defective prince or a shameful secret. She saw a person who was lonely and hurting and desperate for connection. And instead of walking past like everyone else, she stopped. She sat down. She spoke to me in a language I could understand. He turned back to the crowd, his silver blue scales shimmering in the light of the twin suns. Humanity has given the galaxy many things. They have shared their technology and their art and their endless curiosity about the universe. But their greatest gift is something far simpler. It is the belief that every being has value, that no one should be ignored or forgotten. That kindness is not a weakness, but the greatest strength of all. He made a gesture that brought Commander Zero forward. She carried an ornate scroll bearing the seal of the Dracorian Empire. The prince explained that this document established a new philosophy for the empire, one that rejected the old ways of measuring worth by the volume of one's voice. From this day forward, the Dracorian Empire declares that a person's value is not determined by their abilities or their birth or the sound of their roar. He signed. It is determined by the content of their character, the depth of their compassion, and the courage to see those who have been made invisible. The crowd erupted in a mixture of roars and cheers, and silent applause, hands moving in the gesture of appreciation that had become universal throughout the Sector Commander Zero, who had watched all of this unfold from the beginning. Later wrote in her official report something that would be quoted for generations to come. We conquered 17 star systems through fire and fear. The humans conquered us with a cup of tea and a conversation. We never stood a chance. But perhaps that is not defeat. Perhaps that is the beginning of something better. After the ceremony, as the crowds dispersed and the dignitaries departed in their impressive shuttles, Meghan and Callan sat together on a bench near the statue. The prince had brought honey cakes, the same kind she had served him on that first day, and they shared them in comfortable silence. He signed to her that he could never repay what she had done for him. She had not just changed his life. She had changed the entire galaxy. Meghan smiled and signed back that she had not done anything special. She had just done what her grandmother had taught her. She had seen someone who needed kindness, and she had offered it. That is exactly what makes your people special. Callan signed. You do not consider kindness to be remarkable. To you, it is simply what one does. But to the rest of the galaxy, it is revolutionary. Meghan looked up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, her little diner was still open, with Danny and Katie holding down the fort while she was away. Soon she would return to it, back to the simple life of serving coffee and sandwiches to whoever walked through the door. And that was exactly how she wanted it, because she understood something that all the kings and emperors and conquerors throughout history had never quite grasped. Real change did not come from thrones or armies or grand declarations. It came from small moments of connection between ordinary people. It came from choosing to see those who have been made invisible. It came from the simple courage to sit down with a stranger and ask if they would like something to eat. That was what it meant to be human, and watching the stars appear one by one above the alien city, surrounded by a galaxy that was just beginning to learn this lesson. Meghan Torres smiled and took another bite of her honey cake. The universe was vast and cold and indifferent, but it was also full of moments like this one, small sparks of warmth in the endless dark. And if humanity had any purpose at all, perhaps it was simply to keep those sparks alive, one cup of tea at a time.